Hello, and welcome to the Nonfiction Authors Podcast, where we interview experts who help you learn how to write, market, publish, promote, and profit from your book. The podcast is brought to you by the Nonfiction Authors Association.com, which is the home of the Nonfiction Writers Conference.com. We have several membership levels, all of which offer discounts on our live courses and so many other benefits. Find out more at nonfictionauthorsassociation.com/join. I'm Carla King, your host, and I want to thank you for spending your valuable time with us today. Did you miss anything? Visit the Nonfiction Authors Association website to find all our replays with show notes, links, and transcripts. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Nonfiction Authors Podcast. I'm Carla King, your host, and I'm happy to have you with us today to speak with Dave Goetz and Melissa Parks. They're co-founders of Journey Sixty6, an online learning and coaching community for writers who seek a warm, supportive community and are serious about completing a writing project. Dave is a former magazine and book editor and the author of Death by Suburb, How to Keep the Suburbs from Killing Your Soul. I'm sorry, I'm laughing. That's a great title. HarperOne. He's also a passionate fly fisher, podcaster. Two Guys in a River is the name of it, and author of the Fly Fisher's Book of Lists, Life is Short, Catch More Fish. Dave has coached hundreds of writers and served as editor for books in the area of philanthropy, leadership, spirituality, and religion, legacy memoirs, and business. And Melissa is a speaker and a writer, contributing to online shelter publications. She's also an Instagram expert, growing a large following under her account, McGillicuddy. She and Dave started working together more than 20 years ago at a publishing company. She holds an MA in English literature from Loyola University Chicago. In addition, I just want to say I'm very pleased to announce that Journey 66 is a 2023 sponsor of the NFAA's Nonfiction Writers Conference, which happens in May. So thank you so much and welcome to the podcast, Dave and Melissa.
We're so grateful to be here and so proud to be a sponsor of NFAA. Thanks for having us today.
Yeah, I'm very grateful.
Thank you. Yes, we are too. And so are our listeners, because we all get lost in what we call the muddy middle of our books. And you're going to help us out with a solid technique that can help us get through that. This is not an outline. It's an alternative and something that we don't have to be so rigid about, right?
What the book is about. And it's so critical that you know what that thesis statement is. In fact, often when you're stuck and you're in the middle, you're lost in the muddy middle, it is because you don't even know what your thesis is anymore, or it's too general. So a thesis has both a subject and a complement. So if you're going to write a statement about what your book is about, your book is you're saying, okay, what is my book about? That's the subject. That's the topic of your thesis. And then what are you saying about your book topic? That's the other half. That's the complement. And those two together make the statement. So every nonfiction book has a thesis. And of course, every memoir has a plot line, has a story arc. And it's not quite the same as a thesis, but there's what they call a story arc or a narrative arc. So depending on what you're writing, and even if you're writing in a how-to book, a practical book, there's an underlying thesis that governs what goes in the book and what stays on the cutting room floor. So I wrote a book, as you mentioned, called Death by Suburb. Mm-hmm. And in fact, last night I was at the house of my editor from many years ago who helped me on that project. We were kind of kibitzing about the book and talking about what the thesis, somebody was sitting there and they said, so Dave, what was the thesis of your book? I thought, man, that's a great question. And so the thesis of the book was there's these invisible environmental toxins that we don't see that pollute the water system in our lives and kind of destroy us spiritually. We don't see them. So I identified 8 toxins, and then there were the corresponding 8 disciplines to help us kind of overcome that. But the thesis was all about these environmental toxins that we don't see, that are invisible, and they shape us in ways that we don't really know.
I'll also add that people often get thesis confused with topic. And I think that that's where a lot of writers go wrong, is that they have a topic that they want to write about, and then they get into it and they're like, wow, I'm lost because it isn't narrow enough. I haven't done enough research. I haven't talked with enough people in this field to really crystallize my thinking on this topic. And a thesis really forces you to narrow down what you're specifically going to be writing about. So your idea is different from the other books that are in that category already.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, the competitive analysis, or what they call, in traditional publishing and book proposals, the book comps, right? The comparable books. So yes, how do you delve deep and use that information to narrow your thesis?
I'll say this on the outset, is that there might be a book very similar to yours out there. So I want to say that you can have a very specific thesis, and there still might be a book out there that is a little bit like yours. But the fact that you're writing it with your unique voice and your unique stories is going to make it different. That being said, however, to go more focused, to get more narrow with your thesis, yes, look at every book in your category. And we're not being flippant when we say that. You need to know what you don't know, as we like to say. And often we just have a general idea of what's out there. And then you start to dig deeper and deeper. And you're like, oh, there is a book on this. And this, informs my own thinking. And that doesn't mean you have to read every single chapter of the book. Usually you can read the dust jacket copy. You can read the intro. You can read the first chapter, which often has the thesis laid out, and maybe even get to the end to see where they go with it. But you should have a good idea of what each book's thesis big idea is, to help you really narrow what your idea is. Dave, would you add anything to that?
I just think it's easy to get lazy, and I'm this way, right? I have an idea for a book and I want to start writing, and I say to myself, oh, nobody's ever written on this before, which is of course not true. And so I don't do that research. So I would just, if you're stuck, I would actually say, hey, slow down. You're focusing on your thesis, and to help you winnow that and to sharpen that, you look at, let's just say 10 books. I mean, honestly, once you have those 10 books identified, you could go to your library and spend 3 to 4 hours and scan, look for the thesis chapters, Melissa says, and get a pretty good idea of what's out there. Again, you don't need to do 100 books, but it'd be good to see the top 10 books at least that are similar in kind to yours.
When do people typically get lost in their book and find that they need to go back to the beginning and find their thesis?
I don't know if there is a typical, but it could happen to early midway to late midway, but it's usually in the middle, as the title of this podcast suggests. And they're building to this moment, and then they're like, oh, this chapter that I had in my outline, it is totally unnecessary because it doesn't fit what I really want to write about. Or they have engine run on, and they're saying the same thing over and over and over again in the chapters, and the chapters just lose focus, and they're not saying anything unique, or they're running out of stories, or they're running out of evidence or explanations, and it's probably because they haven't sharpened their thesis enough. So I would say probably, in the middle of the book is when they start to see them repeating themselves. They just don't have enough material to make a convincing and compelling argument.
Or maybe they have too much.
That's true too. That's also the flip side, Carla. You're absolutely right. Is they have so much and it becomes this junk drawer, and a book can't be a junk drawer of material, right? We all have those junk drawers where we stuff everything in and then you can't find the one thing that you want to find. And it's similar with a book. If you throw everything in it, your reader is going to be lost if you have everything in there. And we find that we're often telling writers that you may actually have two books in you, and you're trying to write everything, rather than separating out what is it that you want to actually achieve in this one particular book. And we take them back to their thesis. And is your thesis narrow enough? And as soon as you have that narrowed down thesis, you can begin to say, oh, this material doesn't belong in this book, maybe for a future book. And we always give authors hope that there could be a future book, right? And don't get rid of the material just because it doesn't fit. But yeah, that's absolutely right. You often get lost in the middle when you have too much and it becomes that junk drawer.
A couple things I'll just add. One is the assumption that we have always is that if you have a real outline to start, which you do need in your book proposal, right? You need an outline. If it doesn't change and morph and switch, you have a problem, because that means you've done no thinking as you write. To think is to write, and to write is to think. And as you're writing this book, that outline has to change, because your thesis, you're stepping in a river different from when you started to that book. When you start chapter 3, right? The river's changing, it's moving. And so your book is like that river. And as you write, you get new ideas, you have new directions. You look back and go, man, this chapter just doesn't work here. I remember with Death by Suburb, I thought I had the first draft completely done. I realized there was a huge hole. I needed, where chapter 3 now was, I needed a different chapter. And so that upended my whole structure. And when you're lost like that, and sometimes you're just exhausted with the project, right? You're like, I'm done with this, and you just want to push it out the door, but you do need to slow down in those moments and rethink, okay, so why has my outline changed, and should it change? And I would say most often, in fact, 99% of the time, your outline should be changing as you write.
That's a great point. I know that, having run writers groups, and I know you guys do book coaching, a lot of people come to writing groups and book coaching after they've given up and throw up their hands and go, I just don't know what to do next, right? So feedback is so important.
Yeah.
It absolutely is important. And I think of the writers with whom we've worked, and there is this struggle where they're in the middle and they just don't have clarity, and they're writing on a few different things, as we already mentioned. And if you can get that feedback, even just one person to ask you questions, again, what is it that you want to say in this book? And just force somebody to ask you that question so you can answer it very explicitly. That will often take you back to your thesis statement and what is motivating this writing project to begin with. So yeah, feedback is critical. Having somebody to ask good questions. We always talk about that. Like, you need somebody to dig deeper and to really help you unearth the thing that it is that you want to write about.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's dive into your what you want to talk about today, of how to conceive your chapters in your book and structures and all of that.
Well, I'll start out, because I think I mentioned to you earlier that I always failed with the traditional outline. And I think that traditional outlines typically don't work for most writers, as Dave mentioned, because you're thinking as you write, and you're thinking, and that is a contraction of ideas, right? Your ideas are contracting and expanding at the same time. And so as your ideas expand, you're going to have to take some ideas out, and suddenly that structure, that traditional outline, no longer works, because now you're missing a whole component, a whole chunk from that outline, and it can be very defeating and very confusing. And so we like to think of it in terms of movements, like Dave had said earlier, like it's like a river, it's a flow, how ideas move from one to the next, rather than thinking of it, this is, if I take out this rigid portion, then I need to replace it with another rigid portion. So movements has a much more fluid quality to it, and it allows for expansion and contraction, which I think is so critical when you're writing and thinking.
Yeah, so we think about your book as one, as a series of movements. What are you going to say first? What will you say second? Is your thesis chapter at the beginning of the book, or is it at the end of the book? Let me give you an example. We worked on a project where it was a person who had this really kind of innovative approach to eating. She dealt with women who were, and worked with young women mostly who had eating disorders. And the project was called Unweighted Nation. And so the first two chapters were making a case about why it was so important. Her idea was so important. So it talked about what she called the thin ideal. Both chapters 1 and 2 were really using a lot of provocative stuff from the news and like the Biggest Loser and all these data. And it was a really well done project. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 were the thesis. That was her big idea, where she explained her idea, what the book was really about. So she took 3 chapters to do that. So by chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, she applied that. She applied that, the idea. She applied it in healthcare. She applied it in parenting. How do you help your kids with, quote, the unweighted model? How do you do it in education? How do you do it in these different spheres of life? So she applied that. So that was one structure that we helped her with. So that, the first movement then would have been making a case for why the unweighted model is so critical. Second movement was explaining, right? Chapters 3, 4, and 5. And then the third movement was applying it in these 4 different spheres of life. So that's how you think of it in terms of movement. We also use movements inside chapters. So your introduction is chapter 1. So your introduction is movement 1, and the conclusion of that chapter is the last movement. And so what's in between those? What goes first? What goes second? So it's a much different way of looking at ideas and how ideas flow and how they hang together.
Mm-hmm. I would also add to that, I like to think of the movement method a little bit like musical movements in a piece of composition. And you have the opening movement, and throughout the other movements, the second, third, and the fourth, the primary musical notes are repeated in some form in the succeeding movements. And so there's the string that goes from the opening movement to the next movement to the next movement, and even then is replayed in the final movement. And so it's kind of like your thesis. It's in that opening movement, and then in the following movements, it's stated again and again, and then finally in the final chapter. So I like the way that it relates to a piece of musical work.
I do too. That's what I thought about when I first heard you say the word movements instead of outline. I really like that. Feels more organic and more natural and more like exactly how we think when we're not editing ourselves. I always suggest to writers that, don't edit yourself the first time around. Just put it all down. It's easier to take it out than it is to put it back in. So I know you have some samples for us that we know. Can you take us through, I think first, the 7 habits of highly effective people, that structure to start?
So that's a lists book. Mm-hmm. And I know that many of you may be doing how-to books. In many ways, my book Death by Suburb it wasn't a how-to, but it was kind of a list. We listed the 8 toxins, and then underneath in that chapter was also kind of the anecdote to the toxin in some ways, or the discipline. And even though the title or subtitle of the book didn't say the 8 toxins of the suburbs, it didn't say that, but that was the internal structure of that book. So the first structure that a lot of people use, and it's a legitimate structure, especially for nonfiction writers, is the list structure. And so sometimes there's 10. I think the principle here is if the more odd the number, the more interesting the book. It's like those old magazine covers, 107 ways to raise your kids or something like that. But So a list book is a very legitimate structure. And I think it's obviously the easiest one to do because you have, you're going to do 8 principles for leadership, or leading, or handling conflict when you're in a board meeting or something like that. So the list structure, I think, is probably the most basic and easiest one to write.
Then there's the deductive approach, and that's with where the thesis of the book appears in the first or second chapter. And then the rest of the book is explaining, illustrating, or applying the idea. And that's kind of what that obesity book or the book on living in the middle, the unweighted nation model is about, right? You lay out the thesis pretty early on, and then you apply it to different areas. And so it's an application or an illustration explaining. Usually you're doing all 3 of those things within a chapter of a book, and each chapter then supports that thesis in those opening 2 or maybe 1 chapter. Mm-hmm. And then Dave, do you want to talk about the third structure?
So the other one is really arguably there's 2. One where your thesis is developed in the middle, where you kind of build a case for your idea, which your thesis. And so let's say chapter 4, the whole chapter is given over to explaining your thesis. And then chapters, let's say 5, 6, 7, 8, or 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you're doing something else. Maybe you're applying it. By the way, this is a good place to talk about there's only 3 things that you can do with an idea. Only 3 things. You can explain an idea. Mm-hmm. You can prove an idea. Or you can apply an idea. There's really only 3 things. If you can think of a 4th or 5th, let me know. And so often when we get stuck, we've been spending so much time explaining the idea that we need to ask ourselves, okay, who's our audience? Maybe we need to prove that this thesis actually is true. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes you might spend a chapter or 2 just proving that your idea is true based on either some research that you've done or some secondary research. And then we talk about the third thing. You explain, you can prove it, so you can spend time proving the idea, and then the application or applying the idea. And so that is the example with this Unweighted Nation, this obesity book. She spent the last 4 chapters, it was all about applying her big idea or the thesis in these different spheres. So, and even within your chapters, as you structure your chapters, you can think, okay, I'm going to open this with a story. Now, this chapter has a thesis that must relate to the larger thesis of the book. So is this chapter about proving that idea? Is it applying it? Is it a combination of both? And so just understanding kind of these 3 things that you can do with an idea can actually help you also with your structure as you think about your entire book.
It occurs to me that sometimes we don't know what kind of book we're writing at first. I know that I've written a lot of how-to guides, and I had imagined that one of my self-publishing guide would be a guide that people would pick through, if they needed design help or if they needed, to know what to do about beta readers, they would just do that. But I've heard people tell me that they read it from front to back and that it does build. It does build and prove. I think that just came out organically. I don't know if I was lucky but people use it in both ways for sure. And I do kind of wish that I had known about these structures before, so I could have done it intentionally.
I think you did it because there was this natural flow that you followed. And I think as you get that feedback, they just read the whole thing. That shows it really worked, right? And and that's really good news. I think even if like in a how-to book, right, or a how-to structure or a list structure, within those points, let's say you have 10 points, and most of them are really explaining. Let's just use something really simple like how to read a river when you're fly fishing. I'm a fly fisher, so one of the things you have to do when you're fly fishing is you have to read the river. Where do the fish sit in the river? just fish the whole thing. So where do you start and how do you cast? And so you might say there's going to be, this book is about 9 ways to read a river. So you have your first chapter. So in that chapter, you're doing some explaining, but you're also doing illustrating. You're telling stories that illustrate it. And maybe you're applying it to a certain kind of stream in the Wisconsin driftless area, or let's say you're in Montana's or Wyoming's Yellowstone National Park, how it's different in the Western rivers. So even within a chapter in which you're explaining, you can use proving and applying, you can use illustrations, you can use stories and make it. And my guess is that's what you did with your book, which made it so readable.
Mm-hmm. I would also imagine that you knew where you wanted to end up in the book. And so you had a sense of a beginning and an end. And my guess is that you knew kind of these movements, as we've discussed, that needed to happen between the beginning and the end. Okay, somebody who wants to self-publish a book needs to do this. They need to do this. Needs to do this. And you introduce some complications along the way of what people overlook. And so I think you probably had this movement in mind, right, as you were writing it. And I think that that's kind of the wonderful thing about thinking in terms of movements instead of outlines, is that it is a little bit more fluid.
And a lot of nonfiction authors who are writing prescriptive nonfiction intimately know their topic, right? What do you have to do first, and what do you have to know, and what are the mistakes that are being made? And after having done something for 20 or more years, you kind of know what the flow is. But it is nice to be able to apply this intentionality to it. And so our final structure is the memoir, and which is not prescriptive at all. Can you talk about how to tackle that? So many ways. Oh my gosh. I feel like that's the one that has, because of all the flashbacks and backstory, it's the most problematic for authors to tackle.
Dave, I'll let you answer this, but I will start out by saying when we have coached authors who are working on memoirs, their tendency is to want to create another kind of junk drawer type of book, right? They want to tell their entire life story and put in so many details that are irrelevant and are really not interesting except to anybody but themselves. And so we really, not force, but we encourage our writers whom we work with to, again, think about what is the meta idea of your memoir? What is the big idea that's going to tie each part of your story, each chapter together to tell a story that's convincing and that people actually want to read.
It's such a huge thing. We talk about the thesis for the nonfiction, but for novels have a meta idea that drives them. The great novels, there's something big that's behind that. And I think as a writer, you need to know what that is in terms of a memoir. So in that sense, memoirs are so much like novels. I would say this, that the most common structure, of course, is the chronological structure. And I think what Melissa just said, we get in trouble when we just put everything in. We're going to start when we were a kid, and there's no reason to start when you were a kid. But we often do that, and it's because we're trying to tell too much. So we always say, what's the meta idea, Melissa, as you just said, and then what are some of the key themes throughout the books? There's not just one meta idea, but there's these themes that you want to talk about. So, for example, we worked with an author. He was a Orthodox Jewish businessman who had been very, very successful, came out of South Africa, and then sold his business to a German company. And you can imagine, being an Orthodox Jewish businessman who his family was persecuted by the Germans in World War II in that era and had to flee the country, or at least I forget how it was, but there was in his family tree, there was a history of persecution. So, but he sold his business, ended up having this great relationship, but he wanted to write a novel. He knew exactly why he was writing it. And it was called Zadie, and it was for his grandchildren. And so there was like 6 or 7 themes that he had. So he organized his book around themes. He did not organize it chronologically, although it had some chronological elements to it. One of the most interesting things about that book was, I don't know, it was chapter 5 or 6. I remember it because he told about his affair that he had with his what was it, Melissa?
His wife's cousin.
His wife's cousin, right?
Yeah.
So they were part of this small community in South Africa. He has this affair. It blows up everything. He ends up moving to the United States. Long story. But he wanted to tell that story. But part of the theme and part of the why of the book was what he wanted to accomplish with that book. Now, he only published 50 copies for his family. So it was a very focused book. So memoirs, you can do the chronological thing, but you have to do the chronological thing as it relates to your meta idea. I'll say one more thing about memoirs, and that is a lot of early writing a memoir, it's just boring because nothing happens in the memoir.
So true.
It's just thinking.
And that's okay. You know, I tell writers to write it out and then don't be sad when somebody says the first 3 chapters have gotta go.
They gotta go. Or, you know, come up with, let's say that each chapter, just by the pure discipline, has to have 7 scenes. And you know what a scene is, right? A scene is a setting. It, you know, all the things we know about a scene. Just that discipline alone will help you prevent you from just having long stretches where you're just thinking about your life. And so, so memoirs are hard to write. It's in the first person, and what you select. Melissa, before we end on this, why don't you say about what we always say about our major and minor stories? Because I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
Absolutely. So when you're thinking about this meta idea that's going to be governing your memoir, it often comes from this activity that we challenge writers to do, which are to dump in a document all the major stories of your life. You know, this happened and this was really major because, you know, it taught me this, or it, you know, sent me on this path instead of this path. So you have these major kind of life vectoring moments, and you put those in a bucket or in a document. Then you have these minor stories. They may not be as big or life changing as the big ones, but they're still there. They're a little bit smaller, but they're still important. And then you start to look through these major stories and these minor stories, and you start to see threads that tie them together. You get certain themes that are related to the major stories and the minor stories. And from that, then you often get that meta idea and then some of your sub themes. So it's a really great exercise. You can begin to say, yeah, this may be, you know, maybe a memory, but it's certainly not significant, right? Because it didn't really move me forward in any way, or it didn't change my thinking, or it didn't maybe set me back. It just kind of happened, right? It's something that doesn't have any significance. You probably wouldn't put it in a memoir. So you want to think of your major stories and your minor stories. David, would you add anything to that?
No, I just think it's been so helpful to me as I've been working on other projects for myself, because that really forces you to say, okay, then you can create a scene around those major stories, right? For example, if I were to write a book about, I went to high school on the prairies of South Dakota, and my high school class was 16 people. I've thought about doing a memoir about my 4 years there. And I would probably begin with a scene when we were driving there on the first weekend of school, driving this lone prairie highway, and a car swerved and almost hit us and killed us and ran into we saw this whole thing happen, and we had to pull this body out of this car, right? So that's kind of, it was like this car crash that I could open up this memoir about these 4 years. It would be these 4 years that I do the memoirs. It'd be like a quasi coming of age story. I don't think I'm going to write it, but I've thought about it because it has all the stuff that, you know, the juice of, you know, coming of age stuff, you know, living alone at 14, away 250 miles away from your parent. But there's all these stories during those years that could either end up as a major story or a minor story. It'd be great grist to begin the memoir writing process.
And you told us a perfect example of beginning the story in media res, or in the action, which is critical, right, to memoir, even any book, arguably.
Absolutely.
You know,
we were working with a writer just a few months ago, and he was writing a memoir. And the first probably first 4 pages were just nothing was happening. It was all explanation of like what the day looked like outside. And then he gets to this critical moment where somebody dies, and it's a big moment. And we're like, you need to start there. Start with the most dramatic part of the story. And then you can go back and give some color to what the day was like, but start where their action is. So absolutely.
So much great advice, and thank you for sharing. But before we go, I'd like to know for you to tell our readers where we can find you, what's up next up for you.
So we have actually provided something of value for that has to do with structure, just for our podcast listeners. If you go to www.JourneySixty6.com, and that's with a 66, so JourneySixty6.com. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, we have something for our listeners, and you'll get a series of specific worksheets to help structure your book, and they're really practical. In fact, I was looking at them again this morning, and I was thinking, oh man, I should take my own advice. I'm working on this project. So they're at no cost. All you have to do is scroll down, and you can just sign up to receive them. And so we'd love for you to be able to do that, and certainly reach out at any time. We often give a lot of advice. People send us a question, and we'll say, I think you should do this, 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 and this. I will say the last thing I would say is that so often when you get feedback, you get proofing feedback. And that's not what you need when it comes to structure. You need what's called developmental feedback or developmental editing. And you don't need line editing at that point as well. So structure is all about developmental editing, and it's important that you get that when you feel like you're stuck.
Great. And where are you most active? Melissa, I know you're active on Instagram at, what was that great?
Yeah,
McGillicuddy. You have?
Yeah, McGillicuddy. That's where I do a lot of just quick writing. I also have a blog. Dave, we also have Journey'66, where we have a blog, and we do lots of writing about the writing life and the craft of writing and idea formation, everything related to writing. We do have a podcast, also the Journey'66 writing podcast. So if people want to tune in there, that would be awesome.
And you can also look at our recommended resources page at the Nonfiction Authors Association to find them in your listing. Well, thank you again for sharing all this great structure info. It just helped me just in this half an hour. So I know it helped many, many people.
Thanks for having us. It was so much fun.
I'm grateful. Just love the conversation. And as we always like to end everything, now buckle up and write. Maybe it's buckle up and structure or restructure.
Good job. Restructure.
Yeah. Restructure.
Flow. Move.
Move. Yeah, exactly.
All that. All right. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this weekly podcast. You can listen and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and watch it on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or our YouTube channel, where you can subscribe to our playlist. And no matter what your topic is, keep writing. You're a nonfiction author, and the world values your experience and expertise. Thank you, and see you next week. Hey, just a couple more things. I want to give a shout out to our awesome sponsors and partners, which you can find in our resources section, along with a huge list of experts who can help you with every aspect of your publishing journey. Thanks again for your time, and please join us each week by subscribing to our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast audio app.